Luke, I loved reading your book. Before we really get into the nitty gritty of it, I'm curious, even though it's not a particularly original question, but why did you decide to write it and why now?
So I left NBC in 2016, and I came to a point in my life where I was conscientious of time left on the clock. And the reason why is I lost one of my good friends at age when he was 27, and then my father passed at 58. And I felt at some point these feelings of, is this really all there is for me? I saw a lot of friends settling down, getting married, getting mortgages, starting their own families. And there was a voice in my head of around turning 30, oh my gosh, this might be it. Might be what you're about and what you're going to do. And so I decided, with a little nudge from House Speaker John Boehner, which was completely unprompted, that the voice in my head saying maybe there's something else in life apart from this preservation of legacy that you've been living, chasing your father's legacy that you've been living, putting up this face in Washington where you're from and where you grew up. And maybe there's something else out there. And I didn't know what that was, but I knew I wanted to try it and find it. So I started to travel, and 6 months turned into a year, and then another year, and then about 3 years. And I realized that I had amassed all these journals where I had written about different thoughts and feelings and experiences. And I went back and I reviewed them because I thought maybe I should do something with this. And when I read them, it became evidently clear that I was simultaneously looking for something, but then also running away from something. And when those two paths came together, it was when I started to read these journals. And I went in there, I said, I think this might be helpful to people because I'm a son who misses his dad, who's processing that grief in their own unique way. I'm also somebody who's trying to understand this new relationship with mom that happened after my father passed away. And then the need for a reset in life, thinking that even though this path is right there before me, I've had some success at it and I enjoy it, but it's not fulfilling me. Why is that? So I thought there were some universal truths that I had come across when I reviewed the journals that might be helpful to people. And also, I think for me, cathartic to get out. And that's really what I wanted to do is help people feel a little less lost because by writing the book, I became less lost myself.
And also being less afraid to admit they're lost.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things which is so difficult, especially for men in our society, is getting to that space of vulnerability. I know you've talked about that before in your show, but there's something about admitting that, you know what, I'm not feeling what I'm doing is best for me at this moment, even though society may say that it is, even though your friends might say that it is, even though your family might say that it is. The importance of taking a moment and say, is this what I really want? And do I feel whole? And do I feel comfortable? And do I feel okay? I realized I'd been white knuckling a lot in life. And I had basically gone with the idea of, well, you got to do it. It's your duty. You're supposed to do it. Just do it. Go ahead. Suck it up. It's only an hour. It's only a day. It's only a week. It's only a month. It's only a year, etc. But that wears on you. And at some point, those feelings become very heavy. And I realized that I needed to step away to process them. I didn't know how, so I just hit the road, but it ended up working out.
Well, the book is called Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. Let's talk about grieving your father because it was clear to me from reading your book, you didn't really have time to process his death. I know you were in Florence with your mom, Maureen, who I love too, and your girlfriend at the time, and you got the news. How hard was it for you to relive those moments of just pure shock and despair, learning that your dad had collapsed, I think, when he was doing when he was tracking at the NBC News Bureau in Washington and had died.
It was oddly cathartic. And the reason why is I had never really sat down and processed that for years after. I never went back to that day. I didn't want to relive that day. There was so much pain and anguish. But when I sat down in San Francisco at my grandmother's old kitchen table and I started to write it out, it was a feeling of, okay, this was awful. This was the worst day of your life, but you made it through. And there's something to be said about that. You rose to the occasion. Be proud of yourself for that moment. But it also provided an outlet of, oh my gosh, that was so difficult for mom. That was so difficult for you, but you just threw yourself into the next thing, which was writing the eulogy at for the funeral, going into working at NBC, trying to sort of fill the void with hard work and not really experiencing a ability to think about why that happened and what effect will it really have on me, not only today, tomorrow, the next weeks, but years out. And I wish I had been more reflective at the time. But you're 22 years old, and you just think, I'm going to keep on chugging, and I'll be okay, and I'll figure this out later, and just focused on what's next. But writing it put me in the space where I could sit in those feelings and process them at my own pace, and eventually reach a point of a relative peace. And going back with those details about what happened in Florence was, I remembered the level of just grim reality when it sort of set in. And I was fortunate that in my case, some people, they're told a death's going to happen or a death happened, and they immediately go into a sort of sense of shock. And it's not real. It's not real. It'll be over. Something will change. It's not going to happen to me. But
Yeah.
because my father was such a force of nature and was such a hardworking guy, as soon as the voice on the end of the line said he fainted, I just knew. I just knew. He never fainted. He was just too big and strong of a guy. And so that, I think, was a little bit of a saving grace, that I had accepted that he was gone. The harder part was accepting that, how was I going to deal with that?
Tim, your dad meant the world to me. I think he is largely responsible for whatever success I've enjoyed on a professional level. He saw something in me and plucked me from local news in Washington, D.C. I think he meant a lot to the country. I often wonder, WWTS, what would Tim say, or what would Tim do with the state of our country? And we can talk about that more in a little bit, but I wondered if you could share for me and for everyone watching what Tim Russert was like as a dad, because you brought him back to life for me. When you talked about him at the baseball game, or you talked about him buying you the truck, or you talked about him going over and fixing your sound system at your new apartment, I it was so moving for me because I felt like I got to spend a little time with Tim once again. And, of course, we were colleagues, but I do miss him terribly. And tell us about Tim as a dad and really where the title comes from.
So I'll start with the title. The title was something that, the pressure the publishers put on you is to come up with a
Yeah.
good title, come up with a good title. And I was sitting with a legal pad. My dad always used to write on legal pads, and I do the same thing, just write things out, write things out, write things out. And I realized I was looking for something, searching for something, and then it just clicked, because he used to always say, look for me there, when he would pick me up from a concert or a baseball game, or if I was supposed to meet him somewhere in the pre-cell phone era. And where it really clicked is there's a little coffee shop in National Airport here in Washington where he used to pick me up when I would come home from college. And he used to always say in the line, all right, look for me there, look for me there, look for me there. And that coffee shop is still there. And I can't walk by it at the airport without tearing up. I swear I see him there. I see him a little bit of a slouch, see him with the twinkle and the smile. And I realized when those words came to me, that was him. The fact that I thought about that, and it was ingrained so much in my mind. So that's where the title came from. As far as my father as dad, and not Tim Russert, moderator, Meet the Press, I realized at a young age that he had a different type of job than the other dads. Other kids didn't turn on a little box and see their dad on a screen talking. And I remember as a young kid, we would walk by a table in a restaurant, or we would walk on the street and someone, oh, that's Tim Russert, that's Tim Russert, that's Tim Russert. I remember a friend of mine took me out and we went with his dad to a game, and no one was whispering their dad's name. And I was like, why is that? That's a little strange. And then I put it together. So I always realized that he had an outward facing persona, But what he put out to the public was really honestly what he was like. I mean, he was a very happy-go-lucky, optimistic guy. He was incredibly loving and just an incredibly engaging and thoughtful dad with me. He wasn't on his phone the entire time he was with me. He wasn't distracted when he was with me. And if he had to take a phone call, the White House called. He said, "I'm so
Yeah.
sorry. I have to take this. I will make it up to you." And he always did. He always did. So and as I aged in college, he just became such a it's moving into that more sort of best friend and mentor. And when he passed, it was just such a void for me that was just so difficult to fill, and for many years, and that's because of how close we were.
Do you remember when my late husband came over
I do,
and grabbed
I
you by
do.
the belt? You must have been like 8 years old, Luke, when Jay
I
came
remember.
over.
So God love Jay. We miss him, and I that is a memory that is instilled in my mind. And the reason why is we had just gotten that house in Cleveland Park in Washington D.C. and you came over, and you and Jay came over. We were showing you the roof. There's a roof deck up there, and the stairwell was a little bit vertical and narrow. And I was running up. I was like, "Hey, Katie, hey, Jay, come check out the roof. I want to show you. I want to show you." And I kind of was running so quickly that I was almost falling forward. And he grabbed me by the back of the belt. And no one had ever done that to me before. And that's why I remember it so well. And he grabbed me by the back of the belt and spun me around like a merry-go-round. And I always remembered that. And sadly, when he passed, I said that to my dad. I go, "Oh my gosh, I remember when he picked me up by my belt and spun me around like a merry-go-round." And just the sweetest guy, sweetest guy.
Another thing that I really appreciated experiencing again, because I think we were all honestly, Luke, in a state of shock, was when you gave the eulogy at your dad's funeral. I actually remember talking to Joe Biden outside the church back in the day. I mean, it was a who's who of the political world, because I think no matter where you were, what side of the aisle you were on, everybody respected your dad. And that's actually something that sadly I don't think really exists anymore in our current political climate. But I remember you giving the eulogy, and I do remember a big rainbow. Everyone looked outside and it was beautiful and vibrant. Thank you for reminding me of
Oh,
that.
you're welcome. You're so welcome. The eulogy was something that I did entirely myself, and I still to this day don't know where that strength and composure came from. And I went to the apartment that my father had been in the day he died. That was he was setting up the Wi-Fi and cable system for me, and I put my college laptop down on this sort of kitchenette little counter that was there with a stool, and just tried to find the words. And I realized that in his book, Big Russ and Me, he had an entire chapter about loss. And so I went out and I got the book and I read that chapter, and suddenly things just started to flow and things made more sense. And I realized that I had an opportunity to sort of say my father's last words to some degree, what he would want to impart on people. And that was the theme that I went on. And at the church with all those dignitaries there, you mentioned about sort of the who's who. One of the things that we did purposely is we sat Barack Obama and John McCain next to each other because we knew that was what my father would want for a healthy democracy. And they were very cordial to one another. I don't think that would ever happen these days, the two leading contenders sitting next to each other in a church pew.
I don't know.
Um,
I feel like John McCain was such a big man. I don't know.
yeah,
I feel like John McCain would have done that. I don't know. I
sure.
want to think that they
Not
both
many
would
left
have.
though.
Yeah.
But so we did that, and uh, I remember looking out and seeing those faces, and I knew, oh gosh, this is daunting. And then I looked behind and I saw my friends from high school and college, and they just gave me the strength there. And I knew I had to look at them to get through. And the rainbow you referenced was after the Kennedy Center reception honors and
Oh,
the
right.
reception there. And one of the things they had asked us was, can you play some of your dad's favorite music? Can you give us some of your dad's favorite music? We want to play it while people are processing in and out. And we said, sure. And one of those songs was Over the Rainbow. And that was the song that we played when everybody was leaving that event. And as people leave the event, the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow, a friend of mine goes, you got to look outside. And I took up to this day thinking about that. Just this beautiful, vibrant rainbow that left everybody spellbound, and me included. And that was a moment in the immediate aftermath that I really held on to for a long time. Like that was Dad saying, "Hi, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay." And on my travels, I always would seek out the rainbows.
I mean, you brought that back to life for me, which was so wonderful. Almost right after your dad died, you were enlisted to work at NBC News. You were covering the youth vote. You were doing all kinds of things. And that was a fraught situation, wasn't it? I mean, we hear a lot about Nepo babies now, Luke. And I feel like I don't think you were the OG of Nepo babies, but looking back on it, I think that's must have been a little how you felt. So, you're so young, you're dealing with the shocking loss of your dad out of the blue. And then you're suddenly thrust into this really high pressure job with a big spotlight, and a lot of people had opinions about it. How, it was a blessing in a way, but a real curse as well. Looking back on it, do you think you should have taken that job?
It's a very good question. And as I write about in the book, I went back and forth many times. And I think at the moment, I was very much a believer in there is a reason why this happened. And this is an incredible opportunity. And it would be foolish not to take it and at least explore it. And that's what I really did with it. They were saying, "Oh, we'll sign you up for multiple years." And I said, no, no, no. I just want 1 year because I want to see what this is about. And I want to see if I'm any good at it. So at the time, that was my thinking. I think if I could go back and talk to 22-year-old Luke, I would say think long and hard about this decision, because you may be underestimating the level of negativity that's going to be thrown your way, especially on this emerging platform called social media, which allows you to read all the unflattering things about yourself in real time consistently. And I think that
Tell
was
me
very,
about it.
yeah, right. And I think that was really hard for somebody who was young and who had just lost their father. On the other hand, it was an incredible opportunity. It was one that I felt would, to some degree, would be silly to pass up and sort of take my life was a little bit, I won't go as far as in shambles, but my previous plans had been completely broken up. So give it a whirl.
I was really upset when they put you on the air, Luke. I'm just being honest, and it's sort of a funny platform, but I thought it was a very cynical move by NBC. It really upset me. I thought you were too young. You had no experience. You had never worked in local news. And I often thought, what would Tim be telling Luke? And I almost reached out to you. And I think Tim would have said, I think your dad would have said, if I can be so bold, he would have said, Luke, you got to work your way up to that job. Go work at the Baltimore Sun, cover the state legislature, go work on Capitol Hill, like as a assistant press secretary for someone, learn the ropes and earn it. And
yeah, I think
I think that's what your dad would have told you, Luke.
Perhaps it's a fair point. I think I go back to the time about how things were changing so rapidly with social media and how blogs and the internet were rapidly changing the game. So the usual pathways were becoming significantly different. I think if looking back at that time, maybe it would have been better to do one of those things like the emerging what Politico is doing, or
Right.
blogs that would have been less outward facing, but still getting that type of experience. But things happen for a reason, and ultimately, I came out of it okay. But there were some difficult days. I won't deny that, and I think for me it was sort of coming to grips with that, which is, do I actually enjoy this? Is this how I want to be defined? Is this actually who I am? There was certainly a moment where the talent would show itself, but then there are also times where you have to go through the growing pains, like you mentioned in your book, right? You'll get a story wrong, or the source you thought that was there was actually not as good as advertised, even though the higher up signed off on it. You'd
Right.
ultimately, the buck stops with you. And I think those were difficult lessons to learn at a young age. But I got to a place where I was a fast learner and comfortable enough and felt that I was of service. And that was my mentality through all of it. So long as I'm of service and I'm doing something to help out the news organization, then it's worthwhile for me.
Why did you decide, you know what, I got to do something else?
I think it was a combination of things. It was turning 30, which I thought was very old back then, which now I would say is not. But then it was just sort of, oh gosh, the light at the end of the tunnel seems brighter because I'm turning 30. My friends are settling down. They're getting married. They're having children, getting mortgages. Seeing my father pass at 58 and going, oh, do I only have 28 more years left? My grandfather, my mom's dad died at 58 as well. So that number is very much ingrained in my psyche. And I almost stare at it every single day. I lost a friend at age 27, and he was a Couric, who was just one of my closest friends who I spoke to all the time. And those events, losing my father, losing Couric, seeing people settle down, it awakened a spirit inside me that asked, is this really all you want to do? You've gone through the gauntlet that we've talked about. I had come out of the gauntlet and had a pretty bright future ahead of me if I wanted to keep engaging and keep grinding and doing the work. But I came to the realization once I had that success and been near the mountaintop, is this really it? Is this really what I want? Am I fulfilled? And the answer was no, I wasn't at that time. And John Boehner, out of nowhere, the House Speaker at the time, called me into his office. I thought he was upset about some coverage and asked that question of, what are you doing here? No one had ever said that to me before. Nobody had ever said that to me before. What are you doing here? And I said, well, you called me into your office. What do I'm here. He said, no, no, what are you doing here? He goes, this is the center of the world. I get it. It's exciting. It's Capitol Hill. You get popes and prime ministers and presidents, and everybody comes through these doors. But ultimately, you got to learn that there is a world outside of Washington. You got to learn that there is another way of life and a way of living, that this is not the end all be all. Go out and do something else. This will always be here. Go try to figure out who you are, independent of Washington, independent of the Capitol. And then I
independent
got
of your
further,
dad.
independent of my parents, independent of my dad. And so I thought it was a kind of a paternalistic thing for Boehner to say. He had a very similar upbringing to my father, growing up in a working class Catholic community in the Rust Belt. On scholarship for everything that he did, and worked as a janitor to pay for school as well. So his words resonated with me because I saw that as, okay, here's somebody who had to toil and snare for every single thing he ever got. And here he is at the top saying, it's not all it's said to be. Go look elsewhere. And if you want to come back, that it might serve you well. And so it was a confluence of those events, and they were in my mind already. And then Boehner, I think, sort of hit me and got me on that road out.
In the book, you write, I'm traveling for myself, having always been on a trajectory that was never my own. I finally feel in Maine a little bit free. The weight of my past, the grief of my father's death, the shackles of DC society, and the noose of inescapable technology cannot reach me. Maine is verdant heaven. So tell us a little bit about your travels. You've been to over 65 countries. You write about just a handful of them: Bolivia, Japan, Nepal, Vietnam, Paraguay, Rwanda. Now that you did this for 3 years and you did see the world, as John Boehner, I think, very sweetly advised, really wonderful that he took an interest in you. What did you learn about the world, and more importantly, about yourself?
Well, the first thing was, we mentioned Maine, that was the first solo trip I had ever done in my life. 31 years old, and I had never traveled by myself for a long period of time. I had done work trips or whatnot, but that felt radical, which is kind of odd saying now, but it did. And what I felt in that moment in the truck that my father had given me with my dog, my late pug Chamberlain, was this feeling of freedom. I'm untethered and I need to be untethered. But I also, in that forest where there was no cell phone reception, where I'm just driving along, man, truck, and dog, very John Steinbeck travels with
I
Charlie
was going to say,
influence there.
yeah.
Yeah. But in that moment, I began to start listening to those voices in my head that I had ignored for a long time. And it was clear that I was searching for something, but ironically, simultaneously, I was also kind of trying to outrun something. And that is where it started in Maine. And then that would take this deeply internal journey would happen over many different external places. And when I was traveling the world, a lot of that in the beginning was influenced by my mother. My mother was a Peace Corps volunteer in her early 20s, which at that time for women was really the only way to travel abroad by yourself. When she graduated from college, the opportunities available to her were really be a school teacher or be a paralegal, and anything other than that was really difficult and would take a lot of work. So she instilled this idea in my head that to really measure yourself against the world, you have to see the world. You lived a very sheltered, protected life. Go out and see what you're made of. Almost as like a challenge from mom, if you will. My father was risk adverse, my mother, adventurous. I had lived a more risk adverse life to that point. So my mom pushes me, and we do a little bit of traveling together in Latin America. And I have this moment that I've mentioned in the book where I'm going to Bolivia and I don't have the right visa, and I'm a little afraid about that. It's also 14,000 feet up. I have sleep apnea, which is a terrible thing to have in high altitude. It's difficult to breathe. And my mom basically says, go. And I go, I don't know. She says, go. So here you have a mom telling their only son, go to the place where your medical condition is going to be worse because you need to be able to do it and tell yourself that you are strong enough and measure yourself up against that type of opposition, measure yourself about those uncomfortable feelings. And I did that, and it was so eye opening. And I wanted to take that feeling that I had in Bolivia and apply it in other places. Sort of, how will I do here? Picking up, a hitchhiker in the middle of New Zealand and talking to them. How will I do in Africa, in Senegal, and reliving the pain of slavery and trying to understand that? In Vietnam, where the American experience that my parents had is so much tied to that country. Hiroshima and the atomic bomb and what that meant. So I was having these moments where I would pick up little bits from each of these diverse array of cultures and try to bring them inward and process them and measure myself against them. And in that journey, I came to this sort of realization of, all right, well, you've out there, you've seen a lot, you've learned a lot, you're such a better person for it. You got out of Washington. You got out of that very small bubble that you were in for so long. But what are you searching for? And what are you outrunning? And I eventually came to the realization I had never really fully processed the grief of losing my father. And I had been putting that off for a long time. And it wasn't until I started writing out the journals that I came to that conclusion and got some clarity in the Holy Land in 2019, which I'm so grateful for. I realized you don't have to have all these moments of pain. You don't have to feel this grief and live in it so much. Your dad loves you. Your dad is here for you. You don't have to look for him. He's with you. He loves you. He's proud of you, no matter what you do. Hold that. You don't have to do legacy management. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. You are good the way you are, just to live a decent, honest, and loving life. And he's there for you. He's on your side. And you would have thought that it would have happened years earlier, but it didn't. It took me all that travel and all that time of self-reflection to get to that place. And that place of peace is just, I'm so thankful for it.
I was thinking, look for me there turned into look for me everywhere in a way.
It's a good way of putting it, right? And I say that I'm a work in progress. I think we all are. But to have some clarity in that part of my life has just been so rewarding. I wouldn't say it's ever closure because, as you know, when you deal with grief, there's always a wound there. But I've gotten to a place where I'm much more at peace, and through I think acceptance comes peace, and that's been the ultimate reward of all the travel and the journey I've been on.
What do you think your experiences can teach other people about dealing with loss, Luke, given everything that you've been through, and people deal with loss every single day. And it's the hardest thing in the world. I think loss is even scarier than death in some ways. What
especially
would
for
you,
young people.
yeah,
I've been so fortunate that once I announced the book was coming out, I've gotten a lot of messages from people talking about losing their parent or losing a sibling, and it's not something that's easy to talk about because, look, people do the best they can. They do the perfunctory, hey, I'm praying for you. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Like, here's some food, etc. And that's all wonderful and that's all nice. But ultimately, when you are sitting in grief, it's a very personal, lonely experience because you yourself have to deal with it. You can lean on others and you lean on people in your family, you lean on close friends, and people can help out. But at some point, you individually have to process it. And I tell people that you may not ever accept it. That's a gift, but you can learn to live with it and hone in on what gets you through. And so for me, with my father, it would get into this meditative space where I try to close my eyes, I think of his voice, I think of what he would say. And by doing that, I never feel that he's totally gone. And that worked for me. I think for other people, they throw themselves into work, they throw themselves into faith, they throw themselves into their own families. Some people throw themselves into vices, some people throw themselves into radical shifts in their life experience, etc. There's no right way, there's no universal way, because if there was, we'd all do it, right? But for me, it was accepting that he was gone and growing comfortable enough with it that I could talk to him in my own way. And that's how I would lean on him. That the void wasn't as bad as it was before because he was there. I just had to listen. I just had to be aware. And I wasn't for many years because I was afraid to get to that space. It's hard, very
I
hard.
also think acknowledging that your dad would want you to live a full, happy life.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
by
yeah,
doing that, honestly, I feel like you're honoring him. Thomas Jefferson has this quote that I don't really even think has to do with death or loss, but the earth belongs to the living.
yeah.
And
And that's something my mom says a lot.
we're
And
all going to end up in the same place, Luke.
yeah,
So,
right, right. And
it's what you do with the time you have. And I think your dad very much lived that way and would want that to be something that he has passed on to you. I have to ask you about the current state of politics in this country because I do think about him all the time. I wonder how he would handle Donald Trump, how he would handle this era of so-called truth decay or post-factual world, the bifurcation of news between ideologies. And what do you think he would think and what do you think he would do?
it's interesting you asked about Donald Trump because my father interviewed him in 1999 when he was thinking about running on the Reform Party ticket for president. And Trump had always entertained this idea of running for president. And one of the things my dad would do is he would seek out those types of interviews for people that would say, I could be president. Okay, well, let's have a conversation about it. And what he lived by, as you know, the code was if you can't answer difficult questions, how are you going to make difficult decisions? And one of the things that he would do by trying to pin down politicians or people that had the aspirations of leading millions of people was say, you need to have a real, serious, honest discussion in a fair forum, in a fair fight. You cannot go live in your own echo chamber. You can't have some pre selected person. You got to go against the best. And my father truly believed that he would get in the ring with somebody and he was going to give them every single thing that he had because he believed that the questions he was asking was on behalf of the American people. It was the Legion Hall in South Buffalo. It was the waitress in Colorado. It was the guy working in the fields in South Texas. He believed that he was speaking for them. And what he would do, especially if you look at the interview back with Donald Trump, was focus in on policy. What would you do to prevent North Korea from enriching more uranium and getting a larger nuclear arsenal? What would you do specifically with immigration? What would you do with healthcare? Focusing on the policy and then also preparing to such a degree that when a politician would try to spin or try to run out the clock, go, okay, you just had a verbal diarrhea of platitudes that in no way answered the question, what would you do specifically? I think that is very important because when you focus in on the policy, the general public goes, oh, gosh, this person who I might like personally or might dislike personally, they're really either prepared or unprepared. And then the way my dad would ask questions about personal issues was, would this have a negative impact on your ability to do the job? Which is very fair because if you're running for president or you're running for elected office, you are in you're the trust has been placed in you by millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, right? Is there anything that could not allow you to do the job that you were elected to do, which is something that I think is not bombastic. So doing that, asking those questions, and then doing it in a civil way is something that I think he did very well. That he would say, get back to that. Because when you're out there and you're editorializing and you're screaming and yelling and things are done for clicks and there's clickbait, et cetera, you're not working on behalf of the American people. You're working on behalf of yourself. You're pushing your persona. You're pushing the individual brand and the world. It's more about asking difficult questions and getting specificity out of people who want to lead. Because ultimately, what policymakers are is they're leaders. And to be a leader, you got to be made of something. You got to be, honest or honest enough.
In closing, what are you going to do now? Obviously, you're talking to people like me about your book. What's ahead for you, Luke, after this?
When I was sitting in the broom closet of an office in Capitol Hill for NBC, sometimes I would look out in the small little window we had and say, well, maybe I'd like to be a park ranger or something, just get all away from this and do something radically different. Well, I entertained those thoughts for the last few years, and I've settled in that I think I like storytelling. Writing this book was a labor of love for me. It was difficult, but the finished product gave me such a sense of fulfillment. And I enjoyed storytelling when I was at NBC. I liked doing a long form. I did a Dateline, which I really enjoyed. I like being on your podcast, maybe podcasting in the future, but I think something in that storytelling space would give me a real sense of fulfillment. But I want to see how this book lands and also take some time and not rush into anything. I mean, that's one thing that I've learned in my media career is take the time to make the best decision for yourself. And don't don't fall victim to a shiny object or what people think you should be doing. Mix that desire and duty and have a healthy balance.
I think that you can say coulda, woulda, shoulda, but you can also say, wow, that was an incredible experience.
Oh,
It
it was,
shaped
and I have nothing
led
but
me,
love for them.
it,
Yeah, no, I have
it
nothing
led
but love
me
for them. It
down
was
this path.
extraordinary. No, it was, and I'm very grateful for that experience. And and there's so many wonderful people there who I love very much to this day. And I have nothing but love for the Peacock. And I think for me, it's yeah, I agree. You do have those moments of reflection of the shoulda, woulda, coulda, but ultimately decisions are made, right? And you go forward and you chart your own course, but you're all the wiser for it for having those scars and those lived experiences. And work in progress, but I I'm comfortable with where I am, especially as it pertains to dad. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for that because Katie, you know what that void feels like. You know how that can just come up at any time, and when you can have more of a grip on that and a handle on that, it's liberating. It really is.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing so well. Congratulations on the book, Luke. It's called Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. I hope you enjoy putting this out into the world. It's scary because it's so deeply personal and you're basically feeling splayed and exposed. But I think it's a beautiful book. I think you're a great writer. I really enjoyed reading it, and I really appreciate you talking to me today all about it and remembering your dad, um, and remembering Tim for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for always looking out for me. You've always been very kind, and I deeply appreciate it. And you have a nice, honest way about you that I've always really liked, which has done you well. So keep at it. It's great.